was to write down the revelation. And the primary secretary of the Prophet ﷺ was a young and intelligent man by the name of Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit was a neighbor of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was a young and intelligent man. When the Prophet ﷺ came in Medina, he was still a teenager, and he had memorized many of the surahs of the Qur'an, and over the next few years, he became one of those who had memorized the entire Qur'an, and he became the most personal scribe of the Prophet ﷺ with regards to the Qur'an. In fact, in one hadith in Sahih Bukhari, we read that when Allah revealed verse number 95 of surah number 4, the Prophet ﷺ said to the companions, "Call Zayd ibn Thabit for me, and tell him to bring the bones of the camel and the ink that they used to write with." In those days, they did not have paper, by the way. They did not have paper. Paper came into the Muslim Ummah at the turn of the 1st century through the Chinese. Chinese prisoners of war had been captured by the Muslims in the Battle of Tulun, and they were the ones who then introduced paper making to the Muslims. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, they would write the Qur'an on a number of items. The most common item was parched leather. They would also write the Qur'an on the bones of camels, especially the shoulder blade of the camel. This was a large, flat bone that they would use. And they would also write it on date palm leaves. They would make some type of, the equivalent of what we would call papyrus in our time. Some type of papyrus they would make it, and they would write on that. And so the Prophet ﷺ would call Zayd ibn Thabit, and he would dictate to him, in front of him. He would dictate the verse, and Zayd ibn Thabit would write that verse down. And so you can imagine that as these verses were written down, they would have scraps of paper, not paper, but scraps of parchment, scraps of material with various verses. And so Zayd ibn Thabit himself reported, during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, we used to compile the Qur'an from different scraps. We used to compile the Qur'an from different scraps. And so, in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, the Qur'an was written down bit by bit, piecemeal by piecemeal, but an entire Qur'an was not written down. The Qur'an, all of its entirety, from Fatiha to Nas, was not put in one book. Rather, every companion had certain portions that he or she wanted, and they were not arranged in one book yet. Why didn't the Prophet ﷺ compile the Qur'an in one book? Well, there are many reasons for this. Of them, there was no need to. There was no pressing need for the Prophet ﷺ to compile one book. Also, the Qur'an was still being revealed. And in fact, the last verses came down literally days before the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So, it would not have been possible to write down a full book, because it would not have been possible to add or subtract from that book at a later stage. Likewise, the arrangements of the verses and the surahs was not chronological. We will come to this later on. The Prophet ﷺ would sometimes take a verse that was revealed on one time and place it with a verse that was revealed way before that time. So the arrangement is not chronological. The Prophet ﷺ arranged it differently. Therefore, it was not possible to take scraps of paper. Sometimes a scrap of paper should have been inserted in the middle of a verse. That is what happened sometimes. And so the Prophet ﷺ did not command to compile an entire Qur'an. When the Prophet ﷺ passed away, the Qur'an existed in its entirety, written down on different parchments, different bones, but there was no one compilation. Who was the first person to do this? The first person to do this was none other than Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the first companion of the Prophet ﷺ, and the first Khalifa after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, within a year of the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he had compiled an entire Qur'an, cover to cover, Fatiha to Nas. And this is the first time that the Qur'an is put in a book form, cover to cover. Now this Qur'an was compiled in the 12th year of the Hijrah, i.e. literally 1 year and a few months after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and it was done at the request of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala an. Because what happened was that a certain battle occurred, the battle of Yamama. And in this battle, which was fought against Musaylama, the liar, the false prophet, a lot of the huffaz, or the memorizers of the Qur'an, died. And so, Umar ibn al-Khattab came to Abu Bakr and said, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, O leader of the faithful, O Khalifatu Rasulillah, I am scared that if you don't compile the Qur'an in a book form, our huffaz will die one after the other, and portions of the Qur'an will be lost. So why don't you compile it in a book form? So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was first hesitant, but Umar radiallahu anh managed to convince him, and they both decided to put Zayd ibn Thabit in charge of the job. The same person whom the Prophet ﷺ had assigned to be his personal secretary. And so Zayd ibn Thabit began compiling these scraps from his own collection and from the collection of all of the companions, and he required that anybody who bring this scrap or this bone or this, that he was present when the Prophet ﷺ commanded to write it, that he heard it from the Prophet ﷺ, and also he required that the companions heard the Prophet ﷺ recite the verse, either in prayer or in another location. So he required both oral memory and physical evidence. And of course Zayd himself was a hafiz. Zayd himself was a memorizer of the Qur'an, but in order to verify that everything was correct and sure, he then compiled the Qur'an based upon the unanimous consensus of all of the companions. So this was the first time the Qur'an was compiled, and it was done within a year and a half of the death of the Prophet ﷺ by the most trusted companion of the Prophet ﷺ when it comes to the writing of the Qur'an, the closest secretary to the Prophet ﷺ, Zayd ibn Thabit, a young, intelligent man who had memorized the Qur'an himself, and who, by the way, was physically present when the Prophet ﷺ recited the Qur'an to Jibreel in its entirety the year of his death. Zayd ibn Thabit was sitting with him, and he heard the entire Qur'an being recited. So Zayd ibn Thabit collectively, he could have done it singly, but he didn't want to. He did it collectively from all of the companions. When all of the major companions were still alive, the first mushaf, the first collection of the Qur'an was done, and this is called the recension of Abu Bakr. In our next episode, we'll talk about the compilation of Uthman and how it then evolved up until our times. Until then, I hope to see you in our next episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to another episode of our fascinating series, The Sciences of the Qur'an. This is your host, Yasir Qadhi. In our previous episode, we had discussed the beginning of the compilation of the Qur'an that was done during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and then the second stage that was done during the caliphate of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. In today's episode, we will continue from where we left off. Now, as we had said, the first caliph of Islam, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he was the person who first compiled the mushaf, i.e. from Fatiha to Nas, in one book. Before his time, it was scattered in different manuscripts, in different writing materials. The situation remained the same for around another 15 years or so, until in the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu ta'ala an, another incident happened, which caused Uthman to rethink of another strategy. What was the incident that occurred? Well, the Muslim armies were fighting on the border posts of the Muslim lands in an area that is, to this day is called Azerbaijan. And then too it was called Azerbaijan. And what happened was that the Muslims of Mecca and Medina had met with the Muslims of Syria, Damascus, other places. They had all met together on the front lines. And lo and behold, they were reciting the Qur'an differently. And the reasons for this will become clear in another future episode. But they were reciting the Qur'an, each one from a companion, and they had slight differences in their recitation. And these Muslims did not realize where these differences came from. Later on we will learn that these differences came from the Prophet ﷺ himself. But these Muslims were unschooled in the recitations of the Qur'an, and they began fighting one another almost to a physical fight. They began saying that my recitation is better, your recitation is wrong, I know how to recite, you are ignorant, even though all of these companions were reciting, all of these, people were reciting from the companions' recitations. Now the companions themselves did not fight. They knew where these differences came from. But their students, those who took the Qur'an from them, they were the ones who didn't know where these differences came from. And so they said, my version of the Qur'an is better. And the other said, no, my version of the Qur'an is better. And so